Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, or good morning still, I think, yeah. Jet lag. Welcome back after the coffee break, and if you could please be so kind as to take your seat. And welcome at this second panel discussion of today. I would like to thank the organizers for bringing us all together here in Colombo. My name is Donya Hamami. I'm the head of Customs and Trade Facilitation at the International Chamber of Commerce, ICC, which is the World Business Organization. We have more than 6.5 million companies, business associations, chambers around the globe that are part of our network, which makes us the main voice, or perhaps I should say the most legitimate voice of world business at, for example, the G20, the OECD, the United Nations, World Trade Organization, and the World Customs Organization. I'm very honored to be the moderator today at this panel on trade facilitation and logistics in regional integration. I've been requested by the organizers to set the scene a bit, zooming in on logistics on an effective way for regional integration. I'm also sitting here today as the vice president of an initiative called the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation, which is an initiative that brings together the World Economic Forum, the Center of International Private Enterprise, CIPE, which is the capacity building arm of the US Chamber of Commerce, ICC, my own organization, and the governments of the United Kingdom, Germany, Canada, Australia, and the United States to work on commercially meaningful trade facilitation reforms in developing countries in the context of the World Trade Organization's Trade Facilitation Agreement, also known as the TFA. A bit over 1.5 years ago, the Trade Facilitation Agreement was concluded by the members of the World Trade Organization, including Sri Lanka. And I'm not sure how familiar most of you here in the audience are with the agreement, so if you would allow me, I would just share a bit more about the benefits that this agreement will bring to countries like Sri Lanka. Because I would very much like to congratulate Sri Lanka for actually ratifying the agreement, finalizing the ratification process just before the summer this year. We are very much talking about a common sense package that will make it easier for businesses to import and export, especially for smaller businesses. It will make it easier for a country to improve its national competitiveness. It will make it easier for a country to attract foreign direct investment. And it will also make it easier for governments to optimize their revenue collection. So what would the Trade Facilitation Agreement bring us? Well, some statistics and facts and figures that might be of interest to you. According to the World Trade Organization, the agreement will actually have a bigger impact than the removal of all world tariffs, remaining tariffs. So I would like to actually repeat that a bit because it's quite a big thing. We have many governments negotiating about small reductions in tariffs. Well, actually here we have an agreement that provides a bigger opportunity than the removal of all remaining ones. The WTO also estimates that the agreement will generate 20 million jobs in the process of its implementation. The lion's share of that will be in developing countries, 18 million of that. And most notably, the agreement will also reduce the cost of cross-border trade, an average of almost 15% for the members of the World Trade Organization. And in the case of developing countries, it's actually up to 16%. Furthermore, it has the potential to boost exports of developing countries by $700 billion on an annual basis. So these are lots of big figures, of course, but what does it actually mean? Well, I think we heard a bit about it already in a previous session, but when you're thinking about the 21st century, we're talking about global supply and global value chains. We're talking about a world where, also with the opening up of the internet and e-commerce, where businesses, regardless of their size, regardless of their location, can actually access foreign markets for the first time. And in that light, the extent to what border inefficiencies can actually be a disadvantage for local business should not be underestimated. In this interconnected world, in global supply chains and value chains, it's really important, if you think about it, intermediate goods, that they actually reach their destination for the next phase of the production process in a different country in the region on time and in a predictable and transparent manner. If that doesn't happen, then a company is not going to source from that respective country, of course. So the TFA will address some of these bottlenecks, what is it really about? What are kind of the features of the TFA? We're talking about the clearance, the movement, and the release of goods, also about transit, and we were talking about effective cooperation between border agencies and customs compliance issues. So very, very much a common sense deal, like I just said. It's also very important to increase the transparency and predictability of cross-border trade flows. And of course, I know there are many businesses in the room. That's one of the key features of, that's really important for you when you're engaged in import and export. So think about what this would actually mean for the small and medium-sized enterprises, because it's especially these firms that are disproportionately affected by burdensome and complex border procedures. It's estimated that 60 to 80% increase in SME online sales could be generated by trade facilitation reforms. So we very much see, at the International Chamber of Commerce and within the Global Alliance of Trade Facilitation, the TFA is a unique opportunity to really bring all the stakeholders on board to put in place meaningful trade facilitation reforms in terms of customs and border procedures. And why is that also the case? Because the agreement will be binding. It's binding for those countries that have ratified it, which means that if the measures are not implemented properly, countries could actually be subject to dispute resolution settlement under World Trade Organization rules. So, another thing that really makes this agreement unique is that that it's up to a country to say which measures they think they already have up to shape, or which measures they need more time for, and for which they need support, technical assistance, capacity building of the international community before being able to implement it. So there's a lot of support available, for example, from the World Bank, from other banks, investment and banks and developing banks, the United Nations, the International Trade Center, one of our co-organizers here, and also from the Global Alliance to assist developing countries and emerging markets in the implementation of the agreement. Regional economic communities and trading blocs are using trade facilitation measures to really as an opportunity, and the TFA, to harmonize, simplify, streamline, automate the processes with a view to strengthen intra-regional trade. And that's one of our key topics here today, intra-regional trade, being one of the pillars of regional integration and providing a unique opportunity to strengthen commercial relationship with neighbors and to strengthen regional value and supply chains. In my view, enabling intra-regional trade requires three closely related factors. First of all, infrastructure. So we're talking about ports, we're talking about roads, we're talking about rail networks and ICT structures. Not just that it's there, but also the quality of it, of course. Number two, we're talking about transparent and efficient border crossings, the soft infrastructure, the procedures, some of the issues that the Trade Facilitation Agreement actually covers. And number three, we're talking about logistical services for the efficient movement of goods. So we're talking about customs brokers, freight forwarders, transporters, and in many developing countries, unfortunately here, the provision of logistic services lagging behind due to market conditions and regulatory barriers. Of course, these issues are very closely related. The development of infrastructure has been very high on the agenda, I think, over the last decade, and rightly so. At the same time, we really have to also focus, I think, on the processing of cross-border transactions and the provision of quality logistical services. But trade facilitation on a national level is in many respects, of course, actually nothing without regional collaboration. We cannot just stop at the border, of course, because you have to engage with your neighbors and your region to make it actually worth everyone's while. So I'm joined here today by a very distinguished panel to offer insights on how to approach a regional integration agenda and share their views on the priorities for enhancing intra-regional trade in terms of infrastructure, border processes, and the provision of quality logistical services. So please allow me to introduce my fellow panelists today here on the stage. I would like to start with introducing Dr. Saman Gelegama, who's the Senior Advisor to the Minister for the Ministry of Development Strategies and International Trade here in Sri Lanka, in our host country. He's also the Executive Director of the Institute of Policy Studies of Sri Lanka, Fellow of the National Academy of Sciences of Sri Lanka, and he's a past President of the Sri Lanka Economic Association. He's written significant articles and books on regional economic issues, both internationally and here locally. And he's a referee for a number of international journals. I'm very happy that you're able here to join us here today. I would like to jump to our colleague, Dr. Pandian, the Vice President and Chief Investment Officer of Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, who has been appointed in this role in February 2016. And he leads the planning and supervision of the bank's infrastructure investment by promoting sustainable investment throughout Asia, and of course also ensuring its relevance and efficiency and effectiveness. He previously held several positions over 30 years at the Indian Administrative Service. Then a familiar face on the podium as well, Dr. Susan Stone, who was already speaking in the previous session. She's the Chief of Division of the Trade and Investment Division at UNSCAP, which is the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, as many of you will know. She previously also worked at the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and she was a research fellow at the Asian Development Bank Institute, and previously also worked for the Australian Productivity Commission. Then here, second to my left, is Dr. Stefano Arganesi. He's the Chief Executive Officer of DHL here in the Central Eastern Europe, Middle East region. He joined DHL in 2002 as project manager and has been since in various positions before assuming his current role as CEO for both the Central Eastern Europe, Middle East region as well as the Americas. So I would like to actually start by posing a question to Mrs. Susan Stone of UNSCAP. I touched upon some of the issues just now in my introduction, but could you share a bit more on further background on the latest studies and also the analysis on the role of trade facilitation and logistics in especially regional integration processes?
Thank you very much. I'm happy to talk about trade facilitation because, as I alluded to in the last session, this is something that we have done quite a bit of work on and are quite involved in the region. We feel very strongly that trade facilitation is a key to not only enhancing integration in the region, but enabling businesses to engage effectively in international markets. And as you did allude to, the benefits from TFA have been estimated to be quite large. In excess of 20 million jobs generated, $1 trillion in trade flows, and those benefits we see as occurring to a great deal in this region, as this region has been adopting the TFA in large numbers. So for us, what we did in conjunction with the other regional commissions, so in order to get a global picture of the situation, we engaged in a survey of what countries and governments have done, where they are to date in implementing the trade facilitation agreement. So where's a kind of baseline that we can envision? And overall, I can say Asia Pacific, in terms of averages, compares quite well to some of the other regions in the world. Overall, there's an average of 46% implementation rate for trade facilitation in this region. But obviously, there's a great deal of variation. You have countries like city-states like Singapore and Australia that are close to 85%, where many of our member countries in the Pacific are below 15%. So we see there's still a lot of room for improvement in terms of implementation rates. In terms of the specific parts of the agreement that we see countries in this region having implemented, transparency is a big one. More, on average, 60% of our member countries have engaged or have implemented the transparency measures under the TFA. However, and that also has a very small degree of variation because most of the countries, we were able to get data on 44 member countries, and most of those fall within 50 to 70%, with the average being 60%. Where there is a lot of variation is in formalities. Formalities also have about a high 50 percentage rate, 57, 58% implementation rate on average. However, the formalities parts of the TFA, the rate of implementation by countries range from about 20% to as high as 70%. So in this area, we see a lot of room for improvement. Transit facilitation measures had the smallest degree of variation. Almost all countries are in around the high 50s in terms of implementation rate for there as well. And finally, in terms of electronic provisions, which we see as being key in moving forward and being effective in terms of allowing countries to, and companies more specifically, to trade, electronic provisions have only been implemented under the TFA at about 42%. And the variation there goes between 20% and 80%. And so what we've done at UNSCAP in order to help our member countries to move forward, especially on the electronic transfer of data and documents, is we've implemented what we've called a framework agreement on paperless trade. And we've estimated that the benefits of implementation of countries engaging in electronic transfer of documents could be in this region to increase exports by as much as $260 million. So there's a lot of room for improvement. We also see trade costs falling in excess, in some provisions up to 40% with this paperless trade implementation. And the idea here is that it's now open for signature from all member countries. Once we have 5 countries that have ratified the agreement, it comes into force. And the framework agreement basically provides an outline for which countries then determine details under which they would negotiate standards and rules for exchange of data and documentation to come for cross-border trade. And so we're going to be moving forward with that in the new year. And this is important because the research has shown that trade costs are a tremendous part of companies' costs in engaging in trade. And I'm not talking about necessarily tariffs, even though they come into it. It's really, and it's within government's control to do something about, because there's estimates that as high as 80% of trade costs are attributed to policy. And so therefore, you can change the policy, you can adapt the policy and reduce the trade costs. We know that, for example, intra-ASEAN trade costs are as high as, lead to a tariff equivalent of 76%. And this compares to what estimates are for intra-EU trade costs that are closer to 40-43%. We know that in our region, East Asia tends to have the lowest trade costs in around 51%, whereas North and Central Asia and the Pacific tend to be on the high. South Asia, intra-trade for South Asia is 109%. So it's like having 109% tariff every time you try to do trade in the region, simply due to trade costs, which the Trade Facilitation Agreement we hope will go a long way to reducing. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much for those impressive figures. Thank you. Well, after that, of course, I think many here in the audience would be very curious to know more about Sri Lanka's strategies in shaping its trade facilitation and logistical performance agenda. Would you be so kind as to enlighten us on where the progress is going in that regard?
Thank you. As you highlighted and as Susan highlighted, there are a lot of advantages of trade facilitation, especially in reducing the trade costs. So reducing the trade cost to stimulate trade has been well recognized by Sri Lanka, especially at a time when the country is trying to pursue a export-led development strategy. So in that context, in regard to trade facilitation, Sri Lanka has taken 3 measures. Of course, they are all interrelated and linked to the trade facilitation agreement of the WTO. Now, the first measure is in regard to change in legislation. Now, already to the customs ordinance that we have, Sri Lanka has made a number of amendments, especially taking into account the digitalization and the introduction of IT, e-commerce, etc., to reflect those requirements of introducing IT to the customs system. Some amendments have already been made. Then the second thing that the government is planning to do is to replace the Import-Export Control Act by a Trade Promotion Act, which will be more friendly towards both imports and exports, and thereby facilitating trade. Of course, to support all these and to take into account the requirements of the some of the import substitution industries, we are also bringing up new legislation on anti-dumping. So while having these legislative changes, Sri Lanka is also pursuing a very transparent consultation process. There is the monthly meeting headed by the State Minister of International Trade on grievances of exporters, and also a monthly meeting for ease of doing business to discuss with the exporters, the private sector entrepreneurs, the daily impediments they face in their business activities. So these 2 consultations also complement some of the reforms that the government has planned to undertake under the legislative umbrella. Now, the second area that we are focusing on in regard to trade facilitation is to introduce the single window. Now, for that, Sri Lanka started the reforms as early as 1993. We introduced the ASICUDA 2.7 package in 1993, upgraded it to ASICUDA++ in 1999, and in 2013, we introduced a modern version of ASICUDA, the ASICUDA World. So we are building on that, and what is currently being done is introducing the online platform or the trade portal, where the customs is going to be linked electronically to 15 institutions, and out of that already the customs is electronically linked to the 2 state banks that are involved in quite a lot of international trade lending or other trade financing, then to the Register of Motor Vehicles, the Board of Investment, the T-Board, etc. But so that those links have already been established under this introducing IT to the custom process. But there is some way to go, because there is a second round of reform to link the other remaining institutions out of the 15 I mentioned to the customs, especially the Inland Revenue Department, the Quarantine, Animal Husbandry, Food Authority, and so on and so forth, so that better inspection and surveillance is made by the customs. So eventually, with these introductions, what we plan to do is to get the single window in place. Finally, we have established what is called the National Trade Facilitation Committee. Now, this is fully responsible for implementing the WTO agreement. This was established in sometime in middle of 2014. And their task is to, now we have already ratified the WTO agreement in trade facilitation. Now the committee, their task is to implement the trade facilitation agreement. Already the commitments under A category, we have reported to the WTO in regard to refusal of products trade penalties, right to appeal, and the ones under A category. Now for B and C, we are working with the WTO, and in the C category, especially technical assistance and capacity building, we have already made request for funding from the WTO, and this global alliance you mentioned perhaps can come in, and we look forward to the support of the global alliance also. So with that, we are quite confident that the binding commitments of trade facilitation as per the WTO agreement, we can get in place over the next 5 years. Now, all in all, you see, the Sri Lanka's plan is to become the vision is to become a hub between Dubai and Singapore. And we feel that this is possible because already, in addition to the customs reforms that I mentioned, introducing IT and so on, single window, that is complemented by developing the infrastructure in the ports, introducing commercial hub-related legislation, and now trying to create a major export processing zone in the southern Sri Lanka. So by that, what we are trying to do is, already, if you take the Colombo shipping port, transshipment is quite strong. We want to complement transshipment with entrepreneur trade as well as processing through the newly created export processing zone, so that we get linked to the global value chain and the regional value chain, and then the entrepreneur trade, which we think we could facilitate very effectively, so that the vision of becoming a hub between Dubai and Singapore becomes a reality.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that very elaborative answer. Just as a bit of background for those people in the room that are not that familiar with the different categories under the TFA, I noted earlier in my introduction that it's up to a country to say which are the provisions that should be up to shape immediately once the TFA enters into force, which we actually expect to be either later this year or very early in January, hopefully next year, or what would be the provisions that further help is, and support is required from the international community. Those are the category B and C that were referred to. So category A has already been submitted by the government of Sri Lanka to the World Trade Organization, and B and C is currently under discussion. With that, I would like to hear more about the business perspective, also coming from the World Business Organization, of course. So I would like our colleague from DHL to actually share his experience also working for, I believe, the most international company in the world. I think you're in every country in the world. On the role also that companies like DHL could play to overcome logistical constraints, and any recommendations you would have in that regard from a business perspective. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for having me here first. So yeah, DHL, as you just mentioned, is possibly the most international company in the world. We're present in 220 countries and territories with our 500,000 employees. And coming back to this number of employees, I think that is where actually our strengths lies. So it's the know-how and the knowledge that all our people around the world are collecting every day by dealing with all the cumbersome procedures that you are aware of when it comes to border crossing and custom procedures. So now having this privilege of being in all countries, understanding that, and having all these people very knowledgeable about this practice, it also comes with certain duties. So the question is what are we as a global company doing to improve trade across the world? So first of all, because we are long-lasting presence in all these countries in the world, we pretty much know all the customs border crossing in all these 220 countries. And we also appreciate the fact that still today the interregional trade is not at the level where we all wish it should be. Just to give you an example, if we take all the merchandise which is exported from any countries in the world, it travels in average 5,000 kilometers before it comes to destination. Now that indicates that this being the average, we're not talking about intra-regional businesses at most, right? So that is significantly farther distance. Now, what we can do with this know-how, and our know-how is very practical, very down to earth. So how do we export what kind of merchandise from country A to country B? So what can we do with that knowledge, with that practical know-how? Of course, we can only put that at disposal of governments, institutions, agencies, and try to be helpful in making sure that the trade facilitation agreements are implemented as soon as possible. We are great supporters of the TFA, of course. And in doing so, we have, for example, a very strong and supportive cooperation with the ITC, which is organizing this forum here. We are also a member of the Global Alliance that was mentioned already before. And while doing so, we really concretely put at disposal this knowledge across all the countries in order to make sure that this is considered by governments and institutions so that we can really facilitate trade across countries and export in particular, and in particular for smaller business, I have to say, because this is still a very important part of the overall GDP in each and every country, and especially when it comes to developing and underdeveloped countries. So we also do some direct initiatives, so not only through other institutions. We, for example, organize training for business people around topics like customs documentations, certifications, how to export, and all these very practical questions that many of you being in business have to deal with every day. Because again, we collected that experience, we think we can teach also other businesses how to cope with these procedures. Now, what are our expectations from governments and institutions? So what should they do in order to make sure that the world trade is actually improving and faster than we see at the moment? First of all, just one data, implementing one single trade facilitation measures, just take an example, having the border agencies operating 24-hour, 7 days, would increase, it is calculated, it could increase the international trade for any country by up to 4.4% over time. So this is, simple things that could be done and would have a significant effect on the international trade for each and every country. Now, be more higher level, of course, one important request is to facilitate the movement of goods across borders, and this coming with some of the measures that my fellow panelists here already mentioned for Sri Lanka, simplify and improve border and customs clearance procedures, implementing single window. We already heard about that. It is very important because in certain countries we have to cope with up to 7 or 8 different agencies before we actually can export something to a next country, and that sometimes means also physically collecting 7, 8 different signatures or stamps on the same document in order to be able to export something, and this is obviously something which is not facilitating business. Having e-customs, so possibility to do customs declaration in electronic form, having the de minimis implemented in cross-regional as well, not only by country, but having same de minimis per region, or ideally globally, of course. And then last but not least on this one, improve the physical infrastructure and connectivity to facilitate the last mile delivery. Yes, ports, airports, rail, all what you mentioned before, but last mile seems to be still a big challenge, and with more and more urbanization, having big cities, obviously the last mile is a big challenge as well. Then, physical flow is very important, that's what I just mentioned so far, but data flow is becoming as important, or at times even more important. So facilitate cross-border data flow, and with data it comes the whole topic of protection and cyber security defenses. So all of that has to be ensured as well. And then enhance the regulatory environment for businesses and consumers, and that's also a point that was already touched upon, so I will not enlarge too much on that. And one thing that we believe is extremely important and is picking up very fast because the internet is picking up very fast, because the mobile penetration is picking up very fast, is all the topic around e-commerce. So any initiative, regulations, and facilitation that we can implement to improve e-commerce will definitely benefit all the businesses, especially smaller businesses, and especially in developing countries. So that would be my plea to the institutions.
Thank you. I think working for ICC, I could echo many of them, of course. E-commerce, a great opportunity, and more, we see that customs administrations are appreciating that it is indeed a great opportunity and not a threat to customs revenue or, of course, security. So we need to work together, both business and governments, to make sure that we address the concerns that customs administrations have in that regard, while at the same time facilitating e-commerce. So we've been talking a lot about facilitation, kind of the procedures and processes around it, around border processes. But infrastructure was also touched upon by Stefano and remains a massive and vital part of the discussion. So in that light, I would like to ask Dr. Pandian what, in his view, what kind of role investment banks could play, both on soft and hard infrastructure in the context of regional value chains.
Thank you very much. First, I would like to give a small introduction about the bank. Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is a latest multilateral development bank. It is owned by 57 countries. 20 of them are from outside Asia, including UK, France, Germany, Italy, Australia. They are all members of this bank, shareholders. Canada has recently joined. This bank was initiated mainly to develop infrastructure in the Asian continent. Because according to one estimate, we need at least $3 trillion every year to be invested in the hardcore infrastructure to match with the other European countries and American countries. Now, where will the money will come from? So that's why this bank was initiated and formatted. We are headquartered in Beijing. The main mandate of this bank is connectivity and regional integration. We need to connect people so that the facilitation of trade and development will be easier. We need to provide connectivity for transportation. We have started only 1 year ago, less than 1 year, and so far we have approved various projects in Bangladesh, Pakistan, Indonesia, and Tajikistan, mainly on hardcore infrastructure, whether power generation or transportation, which facilitate the transport of goods and services. Now, as far as Sri Lanka is concerned, for the last 2 days, we are carrying out extensive discussion with the government of Sri Lanka. We want to facilitate infrastructure development in Sri Lanka. For any country, if it wants to put export as its first objective for development, then the manufacturing and processing industries have to be competitive. For a competitive processing, you need power. So we have told the government that AIB is very much keen and interested in providing the finance for power development. Government also has given us a project, Sita Ganga hydroelectric project. We have told them that why don't you look into renewable, solar energy and wind energy, which can be easily put up by private sector without the government investing on it. Because Sri Lanka is blessed with solar energy, 300 days a year you will get solar, and there is no cost of input. You can generate power, and this can be easily integrated with the grid. If there is any challenges in providing proper smart grid or a transmission line, AIB is willing to provide finance to develop this infrastructure also. We are also talking to the government to how we can provide flood mitigation measures from the Kelani River, because we have been told that repeatedly again and again there is a flood and it affects the small and medium industries and also people. If we provide infrastructure in rehabilitating these people and strengthening the riverbed, then perhaps the lot of loss which is taking place to these industries will be mitigated. We are also looking into Mahavali water security system, because for the development of any country, you need power, you need water, because then only the quality of life of the people will go up. Thirdly, we have told them that we are ready to look into provide finance for highways, expressways, connecting Colombo with Kandy, Colombo to Jaffna, Colombo to Trichonamally, Colombo to South Sri Lanka, because goods have to move from this area to the port city very fast. If it takes 9 hours to reach Jaffna or 3 hours to Kandy, how can we reduce it by 1 hour so that the emission will be less, the efficiency will go up? So we are looking into the modern transportation, modern roadways, modern highways, modern expressways, which need huge money and investment. And AIB will definitely look into this investment. If last century belongs to Europe, this century will belong to Asia. Because India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, China, these 4 countries together account for 2/3 of the populations. But the GDP is only 1/3 of the globe. How to bridge this gap? 2/3 of population, but GDP is only 1/3. How we can improve this GDP? There's investment in infrastructure is needed. Without investment in infrastructure, we cannot facilitate growth. When the growth comes, imagine how much the purchase power of these countries, the people will go up. That will automatically generate demand for various goods and services. So Sri Lanka is aptly placed in the middle of Indian Ocean, and it can approach Bay of Bengal, it can approach Arabic Samudra. So it can really serve as a middle, as a center, which can connect people from African continent, people from Middle East, people from Bay of Bengal, people from Pacific Ocean. So how to harmonize, how to harness this geopolitical advantage of Sri Lanka is a challenge not only to the government of Sri Lanka, also to multilateral development bank like us, because it's one of our mandate to provide regional connectivity. We are also ready to look into the port development. And if somebody is taking care of the port development, then the terminal development, the container depot development, we can take care. Logistical support is needed. Our DHL colleague pointed about the last mile connectivity, but storage of goods, cold chain, these are very much essential if you want to develop the trade, because Sri Lanka is very good in plantation, in agriculture products. This processing needs quality power 24/7 hours. Also some cold chain is needed. And if you want to develop a transport hub, a transit hub, then the cold chain and go downs are very much needed. This can be done in the private sector. So AIB is ready to look into public-private partnership, and we are ready to step in to bridge the viability gap funding. We are ready to finance to the government. I think our talk is in the very high level. In the days to come, AIB will play a very positive role and a very constructive role in developing Sri Lanka as a regional hub for the people of not only South Asia, but in the entire Asian and African continent. Thank you.
Well, I think that's actually a very wonderful bridge to hear more about the government's perspective, looking at the South Asia regional value and supply chains. What kind of further insights could you share in that regard from Sri Lankan government perspective?
Yes, I mean, South Asia, if you look at it from the overall Asian perspective, this region is not highly linked to global value chains like, for instance, ASEAN region or the North Asian countries. What we have in South Asia is more of vertical industries, vertical integration of industries. Now, for example, if you take the ready-made garment industry in Sri Lanka, inputs to the ready-made garment industry like cotton, yarn, fabrics, we import from countries, among others, countries like India and Pakistan. So that way we have vertical integration. But value chains regionally, the development is pretty slow in this region, and especially the smaller countries. Maybe India is ahead of the smaller countries in South Asia. One or two areas that is of interest in the context of regional value chains are the IT sector, especially supply in regard to services supply chains. And the other one is the automobile industry that is growing in India, particularly in southern India. Now, a smaller country like Sri Lanka can produce parts and equipments, especially in areas this country has comparative advantage, like rubber components, rubber tires, and other rubber-related products that go to the auto industry. Then we get linked to that value chain of the auto industry. So on that basis, we can move forward. For that purpose, of course, better trade facilitation measures, lower tariffs, deeper economic integration is very much essential. And I think this is an area that some of the South Asian countries are currently working on in order to, so that we first have, while we are integrating with the global value chains, we are integrated with the regional value chains also.
Thank you. I'm thinking like looking a bit more again, like some of the research that you and ESCAP has done. You've been liaising with many governments. In your view, what are kind of the modalities or the ways for governments to address the needs and constraints in terms of regional trade?
Yes, we have been discussing these, and as I said, we did a survey, and we are engaged with the cross-border paperless trade treaty that I mentioned earlier, and the modalities and the issues that governments face and businesses face, I don't think are new, and I think everybody's well aware of things we've all mentioned: transparency, predictability. Customs time to get from A to B is crucial, and a research we've actually done with ITC has shown that customs and trade clearance times can have a bigger impact on SMEs than actually the infrastructure in terms of costs, right? So these things are important, and so having efficient systems is what we're really trying to help governments with, and as I said, given that such a large part of trade costs are directly tied to policies that are in place, we feel that these are very identifiable and can be addressed with coherent approach to a regional, and as you mentioned from DHL, having a consistent or even like the same de minimis or the same kinds of procedures or the same approach to customs procedures would help tremendously improve regional integration and global integration more broadly. And the reason that I quoted all those statistics from the beginning is because it's not just about Sri Lankan companies trying to get their goods out. It's about Sri Lankan companies trying to get their goods in on the other side. So the whole picture is quite important, and the trade costs associated with you exporting to the US or exporting to other countries, into India or other countries in South Asia, or once ports and everything come up to speed, it really is about working together as a region to bring down trade costs, to streamline processes, to implement single window, to implement electronic exchange of documents and data, and ensure that everyone is on the same page with these things. So these really are the main modalities that we're facing, I think. And of course at ESCAP we think we're a good place to have those discussions. So.
I think, Stefano, you're the business voice here on stage. Hearing the other speakers and again looking at the region, interregional trade, SMEs. Any last thoughts from your side in terms of the key priorities
Well, key priorities and ease of implementation. I would say infrastructure. It's an obvious one, right? But we know that this is not easy. It is not fast anyway. So what is much easier and definitely much faster is having the willingness of everybody involved in this process, is making the cross-border procedures easy. If we can do that, and that is just take willingness to do it. It's just decision. It's just implementation of things which are obvious. We just need to find a way of making that happen concretely and fast. Now, all the rest, obviously, when it comes to ICT, power, roads, all the rest, it's obvious. But I believe that the biggest impact would come certainly in the next couple of years if we just, all of us, all the private and public sector, put our heads together and say, this is how we should have the procedures in order to be fast in crossing the borders, because, as it was mentioned before also by Susan, this seems to have a tremendous impact on trade cost, especially for smaller businesses. And one more thing, if I can, because I don't think was mentioned enough today, is all about people at the end. So the talents and therefore the education of people is extremely important as well. Because at the end of the day, it comes down to people, and we are in the service businesses, and while infrastructure are important, I believe people are significantly more important, and therefore any investment we can make on people, it is definitely has a high return.
Thank you. I would like to open the floor up for some questions or comments. I know that actually time is relatively tight, but we also started a few minutes late, so I hope that the organizers don't mind me taking a few more minutes to address any remarks from the floor. Are there any questions? I see a hand going up over there. Are there any other questions? Because for the sake of time, perhaps we can combine a few questions and then let the panel address them together. So I see one question over there, and see another question at my right hand. Could you introduce yourself very briefly and pose your question?
My name is Zahiruddin Dar. I'm from Pakistan. Currently a consultant, but I have worked with the Customs Department for 20 years there. We have the example of European Union in front of us, the regional integration and the efficiency of procedures and logistics chains. But the European Union started as a customs union. My question to all of you is that instead of having these trade facilitation agreements and then going the long way, should countries like in South Asia or the Eurasian Union, should countries try to have more customs unions? Like if SAARC can have a customs union, at least the problems within South Asia would resolve and there would be regional integration. Thank you.
Perhaps we can take the second question from the gentleman here on the right.
Thank you. My name is Masood, again from Pakistan, former country head of Pakistan Customs, chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, and controller of capital issues. I believe honestly, Sri Lanka does not need any more infrastructure development. Maybe for future 10 years, 15 years, in mind different. At the moment, they have the finest infrastructure, to my mind, available in South Asia. It's a small island. I can reach any place in this island in less than 4 hours. The goods can also reach the ports at the same time. You know, the problem I see is that ancient kings of Sri Lanka were very, very wise, full of wisdom. Without any infrastructures, without facilitations, they created an environment that 3,000 years ago, this country was the biggest antipod where Indians, Chinese, Persians, and Arabs met and traded. And they traded, and its environment was so good, they traded so much that Sri Lanka benefited. It came to be known in history as Savarna Deepa. That is an island of gold, because all the gold flowed into this country. The more you talk about infrastructure, more you talk about facilitation, it is honestly complicating things. So what to really do simple things. In the earlier morning session, the emphasis was do simplification, that ordinary people who are emerging, women in this country are emerging. They don't know all this, what we are talking about. How to tell them how to open a letter of account, letter of credit. They find a lot of difficulty even opening a letter of credit. So, these are, I would say focus has to be little more for the ordinary people, therefore they also grow up and become or take benefit out of globalization. There was no doubt that, rising tide raises all the boats. This is what Kennedy had said 60 years ago. But now millions of Africans feeling so desperate in their countries, all opportunities lost to have an honorable living, are wanting to die crossing the Mediterranean Sea because they think the wealth has gone other side. And it is their right to also go there and take that part of the wealth which has been snatched away from them. Why this feeling after 60 years?
Thank you for both questions and interesting comments. Perhaps I can ask Mr. Kelegama to respond, and also Mr. Pandian, I think, and please add if you would like.
Yes, thank you for those two questions. The first question, you see now when the European Union was created, there were no individual bilateral free trade agreements with the countries in the European Union. So for them to work out a common external tariff in the custom union was not a problem. Whereas if you look at the contemporary world with around close to 420 regional trading arrangements and bilateral free trade agreements, working out customs unions are not that easy, because if you take the South Asian countries, now already Sri Lanka, in addition to the SAFTA, South Asian Free Trade Agreement, the country has number of bilateral free trade agreements. So is India. So is Pakistan. Pakistan has a bilateral agreement with China, free trade agreement with Malaysia, and so on. So then, to work out a common external tariff structure is not possible. So the custom union concept is gradually becoming outdated now. In regard to the second question, what I could say is, I mean, all those facts you highlighted are correct. But you see, we just cannot stand on our laurels in the sense that even to become a hub between Dubai and Singapore, we need to do quite a lot of work in regard to improving efficiency, cutting down procedures, etc. Because don't forget that the country faced a 3-year war during the, 3 decades of war in the past. And during that time, focusing on some of these areas that need improvement in regard to logistical infrastructure and trade facilitation, the country had to postpone due to other priority political economy requirements.
Shall I maybe build on the second question just to reinforce what you just said? I sort of agree what you said, that we should start at a much more pragmatical, lower level. And we're trying to do so by organizing the trainings that I mentioned before, how to open a letter of credit, how do I export my articraft to country X. That's what we're actually trying to do. This is very short term, but very useful for business. However, we should also not forget that there is a bigger picture, and the higher level of that bigger picture is the trade facilitation agreements. And there, I believe there is a huge potential. And though this will not happen in the next 2 weeks or 2 months, I believe that there is a great potential. We need to invest resources onto those topics as well. Last but not least is infrastructure, even longer term in my opinion. I think the private sector is doing its part there by investing. And when I hear what I hear today, there is a common purpose on that as well. So I think while the first one is extremely important, we have to focus on that now. It's not only that, but we also need to look at the other two elements.
I do agree with you that just providing infrastructure will not solve the problem. You can have a first-class port, very good road, very good railways, but if somebody stops at the custom, at the border, I think everything is over. I sent some items from India, DHL accepted it, but when it was landed in the country where I am living, the custom rejected it totally. Nobody is ready to take nobody is ready to take the ownership. Why and all? Because there is no clear-cut policies, no clear-cut procedures, no clear-cut, no transparent rules. That's why this happens. I agree with you. We, by providing infrastructure, we can connect people, we can connect industries, we can make the industries competitive, but unless the government and the people and the business changes, the trade cannot be successful. To that much extent, I agree, but at the same time, without infrastructure, without the modern infrastructure, competitiveness cannot come. Susan's very clearly emphasized that hardcore infrastructure may be there, but at the same time, the soft skill, the soft infrastructure, that is the customs clearance, excise duty clearance, visa, you pointed out, hundreds and hundreds, thousands and thousands of slaves have been transported from Africa to America. There was no visa. But now visa is a big issue. Our leaders have to address this issue. We may not be able to address. That's why WTO is there, ITC is there, UNCTAD is there. I think they are working on it. I think in the course of time, we will find a solutions so that whole global integrity is possible. And we are all one nation and one people. That's called humanity. Thank you.
It's almost, I would like to close the session, but I think you already summarized it pretty nicely. So thank you for that. Yeah, so it's not just infrastructure, but it's definitely the framework around it, trade facilitation. We're about making it easier, less costly, quicker, more transparent and predictable to do trade. I think also I would like to basically end the discussion with referring to something that you said, and that's also that companies have a responsibility as well. And I think there are many businesses here in the room. It's always very easy to point to the problems and the challenges, but I think all of you together also have quite some experience and suggestions to actually make it better. And I know that the Sri Lankan government is frequently engaging with the private sector to learn from their experiences, and I think that's the way forward. Public-private dialogue, public-private partnership. That's also what we're trying to do with the Global Alliance, and we're happy to explore that further with both the business community here in Sri Lanka and, of course, the government.